What I'm going to say today has already, I think, been broached in certain respects in other papers this morning. But hopefully in this paper I can sort of try and put it all together in the figure of Konrad Smigielski and his work in Leicester in the 1960s. Now, post-war Leicester was in many ways quite an ordinary English city, if very prosperous, indeed lucky, as Sally has told us. But in the domain of planning, it was in the vanguard of change. In the 1960s, the city emerged as a pioneer of new traffic solutions and approaches to the preservation of the historic environment. An original mix, if you like, of modernist planning and conservationism. And one man above all was associated with Leicester's changing reputation, Konrad Smigielski, who was head of the planning department between 1962 and 1972. Smigielski, of course, was a very controversial figure in Leicester. He was notorious for making outrageous statements. Soon after arriving in 1962, he shocked respectable Leicester opinion by declaring at a public meeting that a little bit of vice would make Leicester a truer city. And in Leicester, Smigielski's often been identified with the worst excesses of 1960s modernism, from high-rise blocks to concrete car parks. But as I think we've already learned, his contribution to the cityscape of Leicester was more varied than this simple verdict suggests. Well, let me just firstly say a word about who he was. Who was Konrad Smigielski? He was born in Poland, trained in architecture, and became senior planning officer in the historic city of Krakow before the Second World War. During the war, he served in the Polish army under British command and subsequently took a series of posts, university posts, in architecture and planning, notably at Leeds in the 1950s. In 1959, he attracted wider attention among planners with his proposal for London's road system. He applied on the basis of that proposal for the post of Deputy to the Chief Planner of the London County Council, a very important position at that time, obviously. But he was later informed that the appointment board had been put off by, and I quote, his outrageous, arrogant manner. Leicester's decision in November 1961 to establish a planning department was itself a very daring one for the time. It broke with the tendency in post-war cities to leave planning in the hands either of a city architect, but more normally of a city engineer, a figure like John Beckett, who was Smigielski's predecessor. As Kenneth Browne, who was chair of the Town Planning Committee in the early 60s, explained to the council, we do not accept the view that planning is subordinate and subsidiary to engineering. It is a specialised profession and a positive science which can shape the social as well as the architectural pattern of a city's life. And Leicester, of course, was second only to Newcastle in establishing a city planning department. By 1964, it had 49 staff, divided between 5 separate sections. On Smigielski's arrival in 1962, he quickly identified traffic control as the most pressing issue. And this nicely feeds back, I think, to the point that Otto was making this morning about the emergence of traffic as the most pressing problem in the early 1960s. The 1952 Leicester Development Plan had been based on a projected doubling of traffic volume in Leicester by 1971. But Smigielski's team showed that car ownership was more than doubling each decade And this confirmed the warnings of the Buchanan Report, Traffic in Towns, which was a milestone, of course, and put at the centre of city planning the question of how to reconcile the benefits of expanding car ownership with the quality of urban life. That was, if you like, the central conundrum of planning, town planning at the period. So Smigielski's earliest report in Leicester, the Leicester Traffic Plan of 1964, was the first plan in Britain to put into practice the principles laid down by Buchanan. Now, I think Smigielski's plan was pioneering in several respects. Unlike the previous development plan, it took account of Leicester's history and architectural heritage, as well as its present-day priorities. As we've already learnt, Smigielski was very historically minded. It was written by Smigielski himself in a rather jaunty style and illustrated with images including cartoons and coloured drawings, like this one of Gallatry Gate by Kenneth Browne, who was probably the most prominent architectural illustrator of the 1960s and had previously been involved with Ian Nairn working on Leicester. But it wasn't just this, it was that the traffic plan was also methodologically very innovative for its period. It was informed, as Smigielski was, by a wide-ranging appreciation of international trends, both in car ownership and urban transport policy. It followed North American examples by basing analysis not simply on traffic volume, which was what most planners did at that period, but on home interviews aimed at revealing people's patterns of everyday mobility, everyday travel. And the scientific status of the study was underlined by the use of computer analysis. Again, very early, 1964, and they used the IBM computer at Birmingham University. It was the first city plan Smigielski proudly pronounced, to say no to the motor car scientifically. So as such, the Leicester study prefigured the environmentally conscious policies of the late 20th century. The Leicester traffic plan took as its starting point the 1960s motor revolution. According to Smigielski, the car had become an essential home accessory by the early 1960s, what he termed the equivalent of the family pet, with its own kennel, which was the garage, of course. In Leicester, Smigielski wrote, in the traffic plan, as in any other city, the car is considered a sort of domestic animal, and every weekend the ritual of washing the car, in which the whole family frequently participates, takes place in every third household. Awareness of rising car ownership, though, had to be balanced by recognition of the impact of increased traffic levels on the quality of city life. Hence the essential principle announced at the beginning of the Leicester study. In the hierarchy of urban planning problems, environment comes first and traffic afterwards. In practice, this meant the protection of inner Leicester, including New Walk and Victoria Park to the south and part of the River Soar to the east. Along the boundaries of this area would run the inner motorway, a 4 to 6 lane freeway carrying traffic around the city centre. For those wishing to access inner Leicester, private transport would be restricted. Interchanges were planned for drivers, including multi-storey car parks and entertainment facilities such as bowling alleys, very popular at this time. Within inner Leicester itself, people would move about via a mix of buses, electric rickshaw-style taxis, and pedestrian conveyor belts, travelators, if you like. Most controversially, the city would install an overhead monorail operating on a north-south route between Beaumont Leys and Wigston, with the clock tower as the centre point. This whole network was referred to as the integrated transport system, a means of envisioning urban movement as a single interacting whole. And here is the monorail, the famous image of the monorail going through Charles Street. Following its publication in 1964, the Leicester Traffic Plan attracted national and even international attention. But, as I think it was Otto said, it was quickly ruled out by technical objections from government ministries concerned, and the estimated cost of £135 million. Sections of the inner motorway were built, of course, but most of the rest of the plan was shelved. Though supportive at the time, the chair of the Town Planning Committee, Kenneth Browne, was later described aspects of the Leicester Traffic Plan as abhorrent, singling out the monorail in particular as a laugh line. The plan, in other words, proved much too radical for its time. A similar balancing act, and this is an image we've seen before, a balancing act between modernism and conservation, was apparent in other aspects of the City Planning Department's work during the Smigielski years. Smigielski was interested particularly in the transformation of the city centre. Here he could give expression to his continental European sensibility. The inhabitants of continental cities, he wrote, live and work in cities and spend their leisure time in city centres, puffing politics, gossip and garlic at each other in cafes, wine cellars, at fountains, or just sitting anywhere on the piazzas and indulging in dolce far niente, an important function. People doing nothing was an important function of the city centre. And it was characteristic that Smigielski's first proposal in April 1963 was for the redevelopment of the market areas. The market square, he argued, was in the historic past the main square of Leicester, a civic space for the enjoyment of the people. Smigielski's proposal envisaged creating a new piazza in front of the refurbished Corn Exchange, which you can see here in the image, with the market stalls to the fore. Another image, of course, from Kenneth Browne. The old corrugated iron roof over the market stalls, which to Smigielski made the square resemble a railway station, was replaced by a very controversial modernist egg box style canopy. But the result was that the market square was preserved and at least partly enhanced at the heart of the city at a time when retail markets in many other British towns were moved to premises indoors or outside the city centre altogether. Smigielski's modernism was eclectic and playful, incorporating not only shopping malls like the Haymarket Centre, but also 1960s pop art. Yet it coexisted with a still deeper appreciation, as we've seen, of the historic environment. A city without old buildings, Smigielski was fond of saying, is like a man without a memory. Conservation became a powerful part of Smigielski's vision, embodied most triumphantly in the rehabilitation of New Walk. And this was made possible by the designation of conservation areas under the Civic Amenities Act of 1967, of course. And in Leicester, New Walk, Castle Gardens and the Cathedral and Guildhall precinct were the earliest declared conservation areas. New Walk was particularly dear to Smigielski. He was scathing of the dilapidation and neglect into which it had fallen by the 1960s, and which there's eloquent testimony over there on one of the tables. His proposals were simple but effective, including additional tree planting, replacement of concrete street lamps by Victorian lamps, and landscaping in De Montfort and Museum Squares. And George Wilson has informed me in a conversation that it was to New Walk that he would repair on his daily perambulation from the planning department, often selecting someone from the office to look with him at Leicester's townscape. When he was asked later what he considered to have been his major achievements in his time as Chief Planning Officer, Smigielski nominated the projects involving the marketplace, the Haymarket Centre and New Walk. We might consider New Walk to have been his most enduring legacy, and his renovations remain largely intact today. Each of his projects, though, including, of course, Clarendon Park, was concerned with the balance between modernism and conservation, categories that were understood by Smigielski to be indivisible. Thus, he saw the construction of the inner motorway as the condition of the preservation of historic central Leicester. The bold, even utopian elements in all this are evident in the plans themselves, displayed in the coloured diagrams of the traffic plan, which echoed the concept art of the period, and in Kenneth Browne's wash drawings of Gallotree Gate and St Martin's East. In practice, Smigielski's ideas were often stymied by political opposition and financial cost. But the inner motorway, no less than the renovation of New Walk, stand as a reminder of the ambition of urban planning in Leicester during the 1960s. By the early 1970s, though, problems were mounting on several fronts for Smigielski and the City Planning Department. There was growing opposition nationally and in Leicester to urban motorways and to planning blight, symbolised by empty office blocks. More serious still, the end of the long post-war boom by the late 1960s spelled difficulties for Leicester's shops, the prosperity of which was fundamental to Smigielski's plans for a modern, consumer-oriented city centre. By 1970, Smigielski was also confronting opposition within the City Council, sections of which had become disillusioned with his maverick style. And his fall from grace was to occur in typically bizarre circumstances. Part of Leicester's long-term development plan was to have the wholesale fruit and vegetable market relocated, separate from the retail market in Market Square. In March 1972, an unidentified party made a successful bid to the Department of the Environment to have this wholesale market building listed, scuppering in the process the planning department's proposals to move it. The following month, the long-running saga over the future of the Sun Alliance building came to an unexpected head. In conjunction with the Sun Alliance Company, the City Council had agreed to the demolition of the Victorian building you can see here in Horsefair Street, just by the City Planning Department, and its replacement by a modern office block. The affair roused a powerful preservation lobby, including, of course, important Victorianists from the university like Jack Simmons and others. On 6th of April 1972, however, the Leicester Mercury announced that, once again, an unknown individual had successfully applied to the Department of the Environment to have the Sun Alliance building listed as of special architectural interest, halting demolition. The following day, the Mercury dropped a new bombshell through the person of Smigielski, who calmly announced that it was Leicester City Council itself which had applied to have the building listed. The council, however, professed no such knowledge. The chair of the Town Planning Committee, Kenneth Browne, blamed a well-organised, well-informed group of string-pulling conservationists for this apparent act of treachery. Whoever was to blame, the finger pointed inevitably to Smigielski as the mole within. Indeed, the Leicester Mercury identified him as the paid planner-in-chief and committed conservationist. I don't think Smigielski ever admitted responsibility, but as well as revenge for previous slights, his actions were undoubtedly fueled by principle. His sustained opposition to the demolition of the Sun Alliance building was well known and fitted with his wider commitment to the cause of urban conservation. From the vantage point of the City Council, however, such behaviour on the part of a senior officer represented an unacceptable breach of trust. Following a reportedly blazing row with council leaders, including Kenneth Browne, Smigielski was granted leave of absence some 11 months in advance of his formal retirement from office in March 1973. How then should we evaluate the achievements of the Smigielski era? I think an assessment is complicated by the rising tide of opposition to planning from the later 1960s. A similar tide of opinion was apparent in Leicester, with hope in what might be created gradually giving way to concern about what was being destroyed. Yet planning under Smigielski came to be as much about conservation as the modernism with which he and the 1960s are conventionally associated. Most of the more obvious examples of brutalist city centre reconstruction were carried out by private developers, like Taylor Woodrow, not by planners. It was significant that Smigielski's resignation was prompted also by a dispute over conservation. I've implied here that the reputation of Konrad Smigielski in Leicester is in need of restitution. So often held responsible for the worst excesses of 1960s modernism, a closer inspection of his career and of the record of the City Planning Department suggests a more positive assessment. Many of the obvious eyesores, such as the gyratory road development at St Nicholas Circle, were a legacy of his predecessor John Beckett. Smigielski likewise had little to do with the long-running dispute over the siting of the new civic centre in New Walk. In other respects, such as traffic engineering, Smigielski's ideas were genuinely pioneering, and for a brief time placed Leicester, as I've said, at the head of urban planning nationally, outside London. As his colleague in the planning department, Henry Blacknicki, put it, Smigielski discovered Leicester for the people of Leicester. He transformed it from a market town into a city. And even those with whom he was frequently in conflict acknowledged his galvanising effect. The words of Kenneth Browne, chair of the Town Planning Committee, who both appointed and dismissed Smigielski, might stand as one verdict. Smigielski's appointment, said Browne, was good for Leicester. There are other people who should take their share of credit for what has been achieved, councillors and other officers, but I don't think so much would have been achieved had he not been here to provoke it. Vain, stubborn and erratic he certainly was, but in the reshaping of 1960s Leicester, Konrad Smigielski was a force for good. Thank you.